This is 15 minutes of impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast series on permitting issues, we're going to talk with David Getz, General Manager with Independent Energy and Transmission Developer, SouthWestern Power Group. David's going to describe the permitting challenges his group overcame between 2006 and the 2023 groundbreaking of the SunZia Transmission System, a 552-mile high-voltage direct current line now finally being completed that will deliver over 3,000 megawatts of electricity from New Mexico and Arizona to California. David's 45-year career in finance included executive management positions in banking and with multinational giants Babcock and Brown and Siemens Financial Services. He joined the SouthWestern Power Group in 2001 and took the general manager position in 2006, just in time to get 17 years of hard-earned schooling on overcoming project delays. So, David, the SunZia Transmission Project could be the poster child for the need to break the logjam of federal, state, and local permitting delays. The SunZia saga is really worthy of a Homeric chronicler, but can you give us a sort of a podcast scale overview of exactly what happened?
Well, Herman, I'd love to. And first, let me say thank you for inviting me to be in the podcast. There's a lot to talk about, and I'm going to try and keep it brief, but you can imagine 17, now almost 20 years of history is a lot to cover. Having said that, the SunZia project started in 2006 with an idea that kind of three of us came up with: myself, my colleagues Tom Ray, and Mark Etherton. At the time, we knew renewables were increasingly in demand from utilities in California and the Southwest. We knew New Mexico had great potential wind energy, and we knew there was insufficient transmission between Arizona and New Mexico. And we said to ourselves, if we could get the permits for a large overhead transmission project between the two states, it might be valuable. By 2008, we signed a joint development agreement with four other companies: Salt River Project, Tucson Electric Power, Shell Wind Energy, and financial investor, Energy Capital Partners. In that agreement, we agreed to share the funding and the development risk of this project. About a year later, Tri-State Generation and Transmission joined the effort because they had a small interest in the line and the area. The project, when we started, consisted of two single-circuit 500 kV transmission lines running essentially parallel for approximately the 500 miles that SunZia is today. In 2008, we submitted the Standard Form 299 to the Bureau of Land Management. That kicked off the federal EIS permitting process for the project. In 2014, jumping ahead, after 5 years of very difficult effort, we reached an agreement as a part of this federal permitting effort between the Department of Defense and the Department of the Interior, whereby the military accepted the siting of SunZia some 40 miles north of White Sands Missile Range. And one of the key conditions that the military required of the Department of Interior, who was leading through the BLM, the federal EIS process, was that we had to bury 5 miles of the line in this 40-mile wide key let's call it contested area.
I remember reporting on that agreement. That was a big agreement that you reached with DOI and DOD.
Indeed. We still have a copy of the letter from Secretary Hagel to Secretary Jewell that memorialized it. But this compromise unblocked our federal permitting effort at the time and enabled us to get a record of decision. That record of decision followed in 2015. And in 2016, we had the other key permit we needed from the Arizona Corporation Commission, which is the state siting permit in Arizona. In 2016, We chose Pattern Energy to be our anchor tenant for SunZia, where we agreed that we would continue to develop the transmission line, and Pattern would develop all the wind energy that was planned to use the line to deliver to customers in Arizona and California, which was still a hope at that time. We worked in close partnership with Pattern to move SunZia forward because their wind generation had no other available delivery options, and we knew we couldn't finance SunZia without having creditworthy customers signing long-term service agreements with the project. Thus, we needed Pattern and Pattern needed us. In 2019, and based on advice from Pattern, we upsized the line from 1,500 megawatts of transfer capacity to 3,000 megawatts by changing the design basis from alternating current to direct current, HVDC. In 2020, we and Pattern agreed to reroute approximately 100 miles of the line within the state of New Mexico. We submitted, and to start that off, we had to submit another SF-299, and that created a supplemental EIS process.
Those were, David, just quick, those were EIS requirements. Those were both National Environmental Policy Act requirements. Is that correct? NEPA?
That's right. NEPA, the foundational law for the federal permitting process. Anytime a project touches federal land, you must consider the consequences under NEPA.
But the reason I ask is because we've done a number of podcasts in which people talk about the problems with NEPA and potential reforms. But I interrupt you. Go ahead.
So I want to just say, why did we reroute the line, Herman? Well, the reason was that we saw an opportunity to make the project better. Number one, it would entirely remove SunZia from this contested area we call the Northern Call-Up area. It's an area north of White Sands Missile Range where the range controls the airspace down to ground zero to do their mission. And they have a very important mission, that's missile defense. But rerouting the line would get it out of their kind of what they considered their backyard. And it would enable us to have a better crossing of the Rio Grande River north and parallel then a new transmission line. So again, there were good reasons, but it required us to go back, reopen NEPA, kind of re-permit a part of the line, which added several more years to the timetable. In 2023, we finally got the record of decision for that supplemental EIS, which then concluded the federal permitting process. I did mention, I think previously, that we sold SunZia to Pattern Energy in the middle of 2022. And again, our company, we're a developer. We don't want to own this long-term infrastructure, and Pattern didn't want to own it. And so it was a beneficial commercial transaction. But from that point forward, Pattern Energy owned the line. We supported the kind of some aspects of final development. There was a transition period. Pattern then, at the end of 2023, Pattern arranged an $11 billion construction financing that would enable SunZia to start construction and all of the 3,500 megawatts of wind that Pattern had been developing. So I believe it's the largest financing in North America for renewable energy and transmission. So I'll stop there with that's the sort of, I hope, overview of some of the key aspects of our project.
It's interesting, a couple of things you mentioned along the way. We still need transmission. I mean, this was a great project, but one of the reasons that I'm doing this series on permitting delays is because we still need transmission, and a lot of those obstacles that you had to deal with, they're still there. That's correct, isn't it?
That is true. No, there is, with all the demand we have right now, certainly in the West for new electricity supplies, we absolutely need more transmission everywhere. And I'll just comment largely because the existing transmission system that is owned by the utilities across the West, it's all that capacity's been used up fundamentally. So it's not anyone's fault other than, it's difficult and time consuming to develop new transmission. And I don't care if you're a big electric utility or an independent developer like us, it's very difficult to do these days.
And the other thing that I wanted to mention before we go to the next question, and I got a big one coming up, but is Pattern Energy really deserves some applause here. They are real heroes, and they're trying to build a similar project in the southeast, from Texas into the southeast. That's called the Southern Cross Project. Do you know about that project?
I do. Try to follow all the independent transmission projects in the country, but it's now been renamed Southern Spirit.
Ah,
I do agree with you. Pattern Energy deserves kudos. We are the first company. I will always say we couldn't have done SunZia without Pattern.
yeah,
We tip our hat to them. We needed their help. And I would also say politely, they also needed us and my team. And it was a joint effort. But yes, they are doing Southern Spirit. It's another 400-mile HVDC project. Very ambitious, and my understanding is they've made significant progress on that project.
yeah, yeah. You know, I got to get those guys on the podcast. But let's move to the next question, David. You've said the hardest challenges for a transmission project builder are first, permits and licenses, second, rights of way. Now, let's set aside for a moment reforms that you want to propose. We'll get to that. But let's just start with this. What permitting and licensing roadblocks? You've already described some, but I'm sure there were more and more details. What permitting and licensing roadblocks did SunZia hit? And how did you get past them? What did it take? Just keep doing the paperwork, or was there schmoozing that had to get done? How did it go?
Yeah, so a lot of obstacles. That's just inherent in the process, and we could talk all day about how we achieved certain successes. First, I just mentioned we had 3 scoping periods during NEPA. And without going into the details, every time you do a scoping period, there's public notice, there's public comment, there's a process. When you get to the end of it, the lead agency, in this case, the BLM, they said, you need to do more scoping. There are other routes, other alternatives. So we had 3 of those in a row. I don't want to say it was entirely the BLM's fault, probably some of ours, but it added significantly to the timetable. And that's a case where there is no remedy other than to do more scoping. It's all about trying to find the path of least resistance through all reasonable and feasible alternatives required under NEPA. I've already mentioned we faced sustained resistance from the U.S. military, primarily White Sands Missile Range. Again, I'd tell you they had good reasons why they did not want our transmission line where we wanted to put it. There is existing transmission out there, but we overcame that honestly through probably over 50 meetings with military, Department of Defense, Pentagon, lots of help and lobbying from our friends at the New Mexico Congressional Delegation, elected officials who were in support of our project. I have to name Senator Martin Heinrich, who has always been one of the key champions for
And still is.
new transmission, particularly in his home state of New Mexico. But it was a lengthy, difficult fight, resulting in that compromise where the Secretary of Interior and the Secretary of Defense agreed that we could build the line with 4 mitigating conditions.
Now, 50 meetings. Dave, excuse me for interrupting, but 50 meetings. That wasn't just like, let's get lunch. That was, they must have been asking for documentation about a lot of stuff before you could have the next meeting, right?
You know, Herman, the saga we went through, and I'm not trying to lay blame on parties. I'm just telling you the history. Was every 2 years there's a new base commander at White Sands Missile Range, and they would come in and say, well, you know, we'd explain our line, and they'd say, okay, but could you just move it 5 or 10 miles further away from the base? And we said yes. And then, so we went through that 4 times, and finally we said, no, we can't move it anymore. That's it. So again, it was a lot of back and forth with staff, with senior military leadership, with Pentagon officials. And this was also before the military established Energy Siting Clearinghouse. So that's another vehicle that is available subsequent, but it was an extended history of back and forth. And I have to say, the military are very tough opponents. They never give up. They fought their patch for very valid reasons. We were looking for compromise.
It's interesting that in California that they were able to work out issues with the Navy to build offshore wind. It was remarkable that they were able to get that cooperation. David, should we move to the second part of this
Sure.
challenge question? I have the same questions. You said rights of way was the other part of challenges for a transmission project builder. So what roadblocks did SunZia have to overcome, and how did you do it on rights of way? Rights of way means getting private landowners and other folks besides the military to let you build your line
Yeah.
across their land. Is that right?
Well, this is a little shorter story, Herman, because the principle was, you'll hear a continuing theme. But let me just start by saying there are four types of land jurisdiction in the West: federal, state, private, and tribal. SunZia had the first three. Independent transmission projects also rarely have the powers of eminent domain. So once you have a permitted route, when the route's defined, it's difficult to change the route significantly when a private landowner is unwilling to negotiate with you for an easement or rights of way to put your line across their property. Rerouting the alignment at that stage, if you had a landowner who says, "No way, Jose," you may have to reopen your permitting process, and that again could cause you years of delay. So in our case, we have something like 200 private landowners across 550 miles. We only have our negotiating skills and our checkbook to reach agreement with landowners. We were largely successful in obtaining private rights of way from everyone. Now, the way we do that is that, and this is common across the industry, you start with fair market value, you do appraisals. But then in our case, we work with the landowners to say, we know we have to pay more than fair market value. So the question is,
excuse me, before you finish that, fair market, are you talking about leasing fair market value or purchase fair market value?
well, we would prefer to lease, but we ended up buying a lot of private property because some landowners said the only way you're ever going to succeed is buy me out. And we did that. And again, it's fair market value with a premium. And the question is, well, how big is that premium? I will not disclose the details, but we paid some landowners a fair amount where we had to. We were also always working to microsite the project because some of these landowners, it's pretty large and you could put it, over in that field or over here. So again, I will tell you that starting from around the middle of 2020, we signed a kind of partnership agreement with the New Mexico Renewable Energy Transmission Authority, which is a quasi-state agency that brought the powers of eminent domain to SunZia in New Mexico, and we never used them. We never ever resorted because you just don't want to do that. So we cajoled, and sometimes we went around where we could without reopening permits. Sometimes we paid more than was reasonable. But we succeeded. And private land, by the way, is the hardest and the most expensive part of the right-of-way process.
Sure. Okay, one question left, David, and it's the big one. You had this real-world, boots-on-the-ground experience. So what policy reforms, or maybe more importantly, what better practices do you think could redress for other transmission builders this 17-year odyssey that SunZia traveled?
Well, Herman, again, we could spend all day talking about the details here. I'm going to keep it brief. First, I do want to acknowledge that we made some mistakes. We're human. If we knew what we knew now, we would have done some things differently. On the other hand, it's just difficult to get the licenses and permits and rights of way for a 500-mile line. It's just, we don't agree on things in this country. Funny, right? So it is a challenge. But first, what are best practices? Well, we felt we followed them at the time. Best practices improve over time, but briefly, first, you site your project near existing linear infrastructure, and we did that. Second, engage early with communities and citizens and environmental groups and elected officials along the proposed route. Start talking to people out there as soon as you can. Third, be transparent about your project, the objectives, and the consequences. And by objective, I mean, we always try to stick with facts and science, right? Fourth, acknowledge consequences and mitigate them, which means agree to do things that you might not want to do within reason. So, I will say everyone talks about permitting reform, and it's really difficult to agree between our elected representatives, right? They don't agree on what this means.
Absolutely.
Well, in this country, we will always have a fundamental debate about the rights of the federal government versus the rights of state governments and state entities. That's never going to change. It's baked into our US Constitution. That is part of the fundamental problem of siting interstate transmission. We experienced 4 presidential administrations in the permitting timeframe, and we saw policy pendulums swing from one side to the other. That's another challenge you just have to recognize. Every administration says, I'm going to speed up infrastructure permitting. And then they try to implement new ideas. Some of those work out and they're pretty good, and most of them don't make much difference. I will say what did work for us, one of the things I'd point out is FIPSE, the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council under FAST 41, Surface Transportation Act. That continues today to be very effective and has improved the coordination among federal agencies. Here's a couple of suggestions, Herman, for permitting reform, just to conclude. First, we need legislation, okay? Legislation is the only way this gets permanent. Executive orders, they're fine. I understand every president wants to move quickly, but an executive order lasts at most 4 years and will be probably changed by if there's a change in government. So from my point of view, executive orders are not very helpful. They're a short-term fix, not a long-term fix. So set time periods for NEPA review and the process, right? There's been a lot of talk about that. That is helpful. Make a clear definition that delineates between the proposed action, SunZia, and the other things that are not directly part of SunZia. There's a big debate about the consequences. Climate change is very topical. Do you want to study the impacts of climate change because you're building a new transmission line? There are arguments on both sides, but I would say, no, you don't want to do that. That is a consequence, but it's not close enough to the proposed action. That's an important debate, is how to define, in essence, what are connected actions, right? Third, provide sufficient lead agency staffing and funding to enable the lead agency to do their jobs, administer the process, and keep projects on track. The BOM was the people we worked with were good in general. They know what they were doing, but they're overworked and they got a lot on their plate. And it's understandable that, folks like us end up paying for some of that. That's okay. Provide protections and assurances on final agency decisions. So if you get a record of decision and you get your federal permit, do not allow it to be overturned by a subsequent administration. It's just sensible, law that businesses like us need to rely on final actions by agencies. Finally, I just say keep experienced agency staff assigned to your projects over the course, because reorganizations and, you're always going to have people leaving and coming, but minimize the disruption to the staff. That's, again, we respect NEPA and the process. I say it works. It just takes way too long. So finally, of course, common sense. Whatever is done in permitting reform needs to be able to withstand legal challenge, because it's no good creating a bunch of reforms that are going to get overturned in the courts. And that takes judgment. And I'd say being smart about what reforms to propose. There are people way better than me, way smarter than me who understand that, but it's no good if we don't have long-lasting reform.
Okay. That's a good place to leave it, David. I got to say that we've had a lot of people on the podcast in the last few weeks. We're going to have a few more in the coming weeks, and they're going to be talking about what Washington is talking about, which is permitting reform. And they largely agree with the very factors that you've identified, although whether they can work out the exact details is another question. But this has been an incredible conversation. My guest has been SouthWestern Power Group General Manager David Getz. He's described the 17-year odyssey of the SunZia Transmission Project to the U.S. permitting logjam and the hard lessons he learned, how the process can be streamlined. And it's really refreshing to know that what he learned in pure experience is a lot of the things that our legislators in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill are talking about right now. And as always, I want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, follow, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.